That was three very interesting and very, what George W. Bush once famously would have called an eclectic panel. Man, don't you miss him, given what we've got now? Anyhow, my job, and I'm famous for not following directions, is to open this up right away, Sherry told me, to the audience for discussion, Q&A, back and forth. But I'm not going to follow those rules and just take the prerogative of the moderator for a minute and just ask you all first. Each of you, and I probably want to start right here, said, I'm going to save this for the Q&A. So let's just address what you saved for the Q&A, and maybe you had two other examples that you might want to share, Javier. So would you just give us the Reader's Digest version of those two? Because I'm sure we're all interested to hear.
Sure. The second example that I had is actually in Jackson, Mississippi. There's an amazing landscape architect that lived in Dallas-Fort Worth and believed that organizing her community when new investment was coming into it in the way that Joseph was talking about earlier would make sure that they would get to reap the benefits of those investments. Well, she was wrong. After a decade of organizing and working with the city and requesting benefits that would directly help the existing residents, many, if not most of them, were displaced. So at a time of governmental change, she decided she was going to move to Jackson, Mississippi, and bought a house on Craigslist for $1,500 and picked up her 6 children and her husband, and she moved. Only to arrive to realize that she'd purchased a former crack house that was next to an illegal dumping site. And she didn't panic. What she did was to realize that her job was to be a good neighbor. So as her husband and she began to clean up that illegal dumping site, for them it was about realizing how they could separate the resources so that they could be used for a community benefit. So first she just knocked on doors and introduced herself, and then she started asking people what they wanted or what they needed. Everyone talked about the government needs to help us with the roads, the government needs to help us with our house, the government needs to help us with jobs. And she said, well, if the government hasn't helped you in the last 35 or 40 years, maybe by the time they're coming, they're not coming to help you. So she then did a skills assessment and realized that there was an electrician that didn't have a job, and there's a mason that didn't have a job, and there was a carpenter that didn't have a job. And she first came to our place requesting for what us is very little money, $75,000 for a demonstration garden, permaculture garden that would begin to inspire community to understand what they could do to save themselves or to help themselves. And then 2 years later, she came back and she asked for a slightly larger chunk of money and got $500,000 to buy up all of the land that speculators were coming into because the government had made an economic development zone of the primary artery that was next to this community. So she bought up the land and didn't tell anyone that she bought it. She just let people be concerned and get engaged in what they wanted to plan for their future. So they've been activating those spaces. They've rehabbed one of the abandoned houses into a commercial kitchen that's next to a technology center. They've made a locally run and owned bed and breakfast. One of the primary food sources, because there aren't grocery stores in this neighborhood, is a woman's house, and she was called the Candy Lady. Her house is falling in on her because she hasn't been able to make enough money to be able to fix it. So the community came together to realize, well, how do we use the carpenter and the electrician and maybe some resources that NIA had received from us in order to make sure that there was a permanent community-owned structure to provide food and resources to the community that wasn't falling in on itself. So just an example of how she's now creating a cooperative community land trust, working. One of the things I'm always impressed with NIA is that she understands the importance of the aesthetics and the velocity of change in order to make sure that people are prepared for what is happening. And so that when change comes, these residents don't believe that it's because of the $500,000 that Art Place deployed, but it's because they did it themselves. So that the next time there's a challenge, they don't believe that they need to go and find another $500,000 to solve their problem, but that they know that they have the resources and the wherewithal to do it themselves. So I'm going to stop there because that was a pretty big one.
Great.
Maybe just to pick up there, in the category of where these unexpected pieces come together, the South Dakota Pine Ridge Reservation, which is one of the, I think, competitively poorest places in the United States, is home to a promise zone, was home to a FEMA declaration of a flood, and if you're like, how does this connect to the artwork? Part of the Promise Zone work is through a regenerative farming operation with a very youthfully led multi-generation housing and farming operation. Part of what we're doing and the federal government is funding in the Promise Zone is the Lakota Language Revival Project, which is something that other arts investors are part of, and you might not think of as being something that the federal government would be doing, but we see the alignment of revival of a place and their culture as essential to the physical space. So I wanted to pick up on how these pieces connect. On the left on the table, I mean, one piece I wanted to offer up and let you know about is that we're working to train federal leaders on an annual basis, and this will happen into the next administration through a nonprofit partner called the Partnership for Public Service, which has helped us invest in kind of bringing the best practices and stories like we've heard here of what's working and what's not working to federal leaders. I think this is something we could do much more connected to the work of folks in the room. And so one offering is, as you're thinking about lessons and practices from your evolving field structures, how do we connect this? We had a conversation this morning at breakfast about how it's kind of happening informally by some of us. In Rocky Mount, one of the best case studies for philanthropy is also one of the most interesting case studies we've made all 400 feds go through on where the train tracks stop. So that's one space that I'm interested to open up a conversation about how the people in the work are really important, and how you might think about us as partners.
Cool.
The thing that I wanted to add was actually, it's something I learned from Chilean organizing in the MPL model, for those of you who are interested in learning more about it. And they had a model that I've been talking to folks about where they talk about the need to engage in a three-pronged strategy of working within the state or the system, working against the system, and working outside the system. And that was really eye-opening for me because in Arizona, where you have like just hardcore conservative legislation that's coming out from the state level with a very deeply rooted business censoring for how city operations are supposed to happen, like you're just up against a ton. And you know, for a long time, at least locally, I think folks often found themselves in the within strategy or the against strategy. And we oftentimes fought each other, where, you know, folks like myself who were like, we're gonna build power in the city, we're gonna elect 5 votes on that council out of 9 so we can like move policy. And even with that success, like it didn't pan out, right? Like these are still the same people we elected are the same folks who had first thing they did was, South Phoenix has so much vacant land, let's sell all of it to like balance our books. And these are our friends, right, that we got elected. And on the other hand, you had folks who were consistently fighting against the system, saying these folks are sellouts, we shouldn't even be worrying with them, we need to do direct action, that's where it's at. And when we had these organizers from Chile come in with all of us who had like these tumultuous relationships with each other, and they offered this up and they said, look, you guys are doing these things and you're often fighting each other about whose is better. And the truth is you need both of them and you need an outside strategy. And we're like, what's an outside strategy? And the thing that was very clear to me is that in this work, there is so much fatigue. And there is so much like you're up against and so much pain that you're going through as you're doing this work. And you're asking people to fight this fight, whether it's the inside fight or the against fight, and they're grinding it out with the hope of like going to some grand vision. And the Chilean organizer said, you know, you need to, they call it the vida digna, and you need to manifest that now. You can't wait. People are hurting now. And when I hear people talk about co-ops and reclaiming space, and making it their own and stepping into places where they can be the artists and the developers and the urban planners, like that's all the outside strategy, and it needs to be invested in just as much as the other two. And at least in Arizona, like I feel like we haven't had enough of that. And so much of that is because, again, so much of our history is just erased. And so much of the healing starts with just reconnecting to that history that's not in books and that's not reflected on the walls of our public spaces. And that in and of itself is a lot of outside work. It's not, the system doesn't hold it, they don't need to hold it, and we can start that ourselves by reconnecting with our own history that lives within the community we're trying to operate with. And it's just one example of an outside strategy of giving people, like letting people know, in order to win, you actually have to step up into your full self. It's not just the fighter on the ground, but again, it's the artist, it's the healer, it's the teacher, and making those things very real in real time that represent the kind of community you want to live in. So that was the other thing I wanted to throw out there.
Great. Anybody want to react to anybody else's short TED-like talk? We don't talk about TED Talks at the Aspen Institute, which is a little bit of a competitor, but to the others' spoken moments earlier, anybody want to react to that?
For those of you that don't know Tara, she's the real deal. And so when she says you can come talk to her and she's going to help you find a solution, she actually will.
Yeah. 2 N's, 2 S's, not too hard.
No, she's been an amazing partner for us, and even thinking about how do our philanthropic partners think through their relationship to the federal government, and how do they, one of the really brilliant things about the designers of my organization is that they understood that there's an inside game and there's an outside game. And both of those are necessary in order for us to really drive change when it comes to systems and structures. And so the leadership of Tara and several other leaders inside of this administration have been really incredible in getting that done.
I want to give a thumbs up on this inside-outside piece. I'm a big fan of seat switching. I'm a former anti-war organizer. Who knows what I'm doing at OMB? I know, actually, very clearly. But I think that the need for these 3 columns, for the natural tension between 2 or 3 of them at a time, but how we're not going to get across to a place of equitable, growth, or a new vision for what transportation looks like without strong energy behind all 3 is really important. And I think partly because people live in the columns to some extent, we're going to need all of them. So.
Terrific. Let's open it up now. Now I will follow directions finally, and encourage folks to share what they learned from this discussion, what it triggered for your own work. Questions for our incredibly eclectic presenters. I mean, it's fascinating to have a grassroots organizer, a federal organizer, and an arts intermediary organizer kind of share a conversation. And I do see a through line, and I'll be curious if folks agree with me or disagree, but it is really a through line of, and it started with survival, but it's really a through line of survival to self-determination, and that's really the kind of work that each of you kind of lives through different mechanisms and means, and it's just been, I think it's really been compelling, and my brain's spinning. Hopefully some of yours are as well. So let's start with the questions and comments.
So the inside and the outside, what's become so apparent through this conference and this panel is the role of leadership, and especially young and energetic and creative leadership. And I think this is the first time I've actually seen true leadership within the federal government on a stage, so thanks to her. What's the role of philanthropy in cultivating leadership? I mean, so many times foundations act as if their job is to find leaders and invest in leaders. And you guys are making it really clear that this is a long-term process of people kind of coming into their own, stepping into their power, seeing the vision. And I think something that also foundations have to share the journey with, that it's not just investing. So what's the kind of co-creative process for leadership development, both inside and outside communities and institutions?
It's a great question. Anybody?
So with philanthropy in particular, so in Arizona, philanthropy is still pretty white. And I think that's kind of the national trend is what I'm learning. But what I find...
Well, you wouldn't know it from this conference, from the speakers at this conference.
It's true. What I find is that, so when the partnership that CNL has with Vitalis is very much a partnership and started with a very personal relationship between Raquel, who also comes from an organizing background, and happens to be in that position of power. And so that's one thing I would say. But I do think that, Philanthropy oftentimes goes to folks like me and they say, the leadership development of this community is so important. How do we get Black and brown people to like step into leadership, right? And that's like the only thing they want to focus on. And my pushback is oftentimes, well, what's your responsibility, right? Like you have your own community that also needs to be organized, right? You have your own hearts and minds that also need to be moved. You have your own people that you need to recruit to this fight and this movement. And that community is different than mine. So I'm glad to talk to you about how I am engaging my community and recruiting those leaders and investing in leadership development. But I'm not going to talk to you about that unless you talk to me about how you're doing that as well. And that's been, that to me is like true partnership, is where I can, Raquel and I can really sit down and map out, all right, here's who Raquel needs to be reaching out to, and by extension, the staff of Vitalist, and here's who I need to be reaching out to. And a lot of times it's understanding role and authority and boundary of the work that you're trying to hold. And as long as those things are clear, and Vitalist knows that my role is to bring funders to the table and to pave the way for them to show up correct, in the same way that that's my role, to work with community and have them show up to the table, like ready to go. And I just feel like having that clarity of role is really important.
I have two thoughts, Doug. One is, we frequently think about leadership just in the world as like investment in the individual, which is worthy, but half a loaf. In that I'm like, I think I benefit from like 48 more hours with these two guys, just like unstructured. That thinking about the network of leaders when you're doing hard work that is grueling, where and kind of takes its personal toll, the power of, and this has been true for me, the power of having another set of people in different seats to lean on is equally important. So I think thinking both about cultivation of individuals and individuals in network, and being creative about what we mean by the network. The second piece is, this is a conclusion we have come to on what makes our place-based work successful. We looked around and saw that at the program level, where the things were succeeding, it wasn't simply a series of factors of the capacity. There was a leader on the community side and a leader on the Fed side, and that you could not make up for the gap on that. But what we can do is cultivate more of it, and part of the work over the past couple of years has been to invest more in the leaders, to network them together. I'll say Sherry had made yeoman's effort to get some of my career partners here too, and I will say the getting to Aspen was a limiting factor that prevented agency career leaders from being here. So like, if you're wondering where the gaps are for my peers,
Take note of that.
that literally, like the Fed rules and budget on investing in individuals for decent reasons and sometimes just for austerity have gone to the absolute like, why? What is the purpose? What will you get out of it? That is not in your region. How could you travel? What does that hotel cost? That like, actually, this is good space and learning. So, is there a space for philanthropy in there for creating the space for leaders to network? Absolutely.
Any other thoughts on leadership?
Yeah, we've actually been talking a lot about it with Laura this morning, with Chantal last night at dinner. And I think, I don't know that we figured it out in any way, shape, or form. And sometimes fall into the same mistakes as Laura was alluding to this morning of picking the same 6 people in that place, and thinking about how can we invest in them. I think one of the questions I do end up asking myself is, what's my role inside of philanthropy of uplifting other worldviews about what leadership looks like? And there are lots of questions that end up coming up in our panel process about appropriate capacity for absorbing and deploying the kind of capital that we deploy. And in that, sort of being able to raise that most of our standards of capacity are based in a particular white structural worldview. And how do we begin to understand that low-income communities and communities of color haven't been afforded historically the same opportunity to receive, whether it's philanthropic or for-profit capital, and just try and mess it up and learn something and share and still be able to go back to the well and get more in the way that other communities have been able to. And so how do I create space for those trials and that access to be there, no matter how that leadership on the ground actually looks?
Yeah. I mean, we can shift to other questions, but this is such a huge question, and I hear 3 or 4 questions within it, and one is the sort of role of philanthropic leadership, which folks touched on, and it tends to be kind of white leadership in Arizona, and I think semi-conservative, we could assume, are not very risk-taking. And so there's that whole question of the role of funders being able to provide cover by being leaders that are backing up grassroots partners and equity and social justice focused leaders in a community. There's that leadership in community question, and how do you cultivate and sustain that, and what are the pathways to kind of organic, self-determined, ongoing, we don't need to talk about resilience because we lead kinds of questions in the question, I think. And it just makes me want to suggest that as we begin to get ready to shift to the closing, which is sort of what comes next, I think leadership actually in the context of the last couple of days should be something we're all trying to think through, understand the best models, think about where the connections could be with existing examples of really supporting and elevating community leadership in a way that's very intentional and about building on the capacity of a community to determine for itself its own future. And I don't know the answer to that, but I think a lot of you have pieces of that answer. We've heard some of the pieces from the Colorado Trust yesterday to the folks at the California Endowment at a breakout. There are pieces to that answer in this room, and maybe that's something we want to drill down on, because I think it's a critical question, and I hear you all grappling with it as well. Any other questions, comments, thoughts that were triggered from our amazing 3 Aspen talks? Dennis.
Hey there. Great panel. Thanks for all the things you shared. So Tara, I have a question for you around, so you talked about the federal government and how it's evolved over the last few years under Obama's administration, and that it's streamlining government and it's thinking about places differently. And you presented it in a way that suggests that it's a little bit resilient, actually, and that we're not going to just lose it when we get the next administration. Can you say a little bit more about what philanthropy and nonprofits and others can do to actually make some of those shifts both more permanent but even more effective?
Sure. 2 parts. One, and maybe I'll, in case you doubt me, let me give you some concrete ways that I mean, the programs I think will change. It's part of why I didn't want, and that should happen. That's what every administration does. Some of them have a long tail for folks who work in promise zones. We've established a level of guidance that we think for 10 years that preference will be in place, and we're working hard at that. So that's one that will, just on a program level, will carry through. But 3 things that I believe will stick irrespective of any administration. And this is in part, we've done some deep learning. There was a very enlightened but not very sticky attempt at this in the Cuomo administration through Community Build, where a new group of people who are political appointees came in and hired a new group of people, abandoned the career architecture, and the thing was gone in 10 years between Congress and kind of organ rejection. The HUD right now is undergoing a very aggressive career-led process where they ask the folks who are working in the field what's missing and what would make them be better at doing their jobs in service. What are the types of things that they would need? And it's taken a very long time, but I believe it will last longer because it's bottom up internally. One piece that will stick, and I think this is a node for philanthropy to plug into, is the federal government's huge. We work by agency on topic. If you are leading the local foods, local places from EPA, the kind of frontier food work, you may not be able to go talk to your peer at USDA without coming up through your boss and coming over and coming back down through the system. It's not even easy to find that person. We've created like very low technology that allows anyone to join a kind of flat community of practice. We started in May. We have 700 people in it. It's extremely active. It's a experiment for the federal government in allowing people to raise their hand and self-organize. We have innovation calls every 2 weeks. They're booked through 2017, where someone says, I want to do a lessons learned on resilience. We have about 80 to 140 people on these calls. It's a very career-led architecture. This energy of folks who are doing like work in dissimilar places is sticky and now has a kind of platform for sustained work. And I'd love to find ways about how to make that platform meet your work. But that's one that I think will stay behind. This investment, I think, in people and in the skills, I hope, is another piece that will stay behind. We've left a couple of structural tools, not to wonk you out, but there's a MOA across 16 agencies to increase technical assistance. We found it was a really hard thing for agencies you needed like a really enlightened lawyer to make their authorities work. So we've left behind some bureaucratic fixes. On how we do this better together, I mean, you're an incredibly powerful group of people. I think sometimes you get what you demand out of your partners, your federal government, your local government. So, I think if there are parts of this architecture that are working for you, I would not take for granted that the work that's happened and iterated over not just this administration, but over really the past decade or two, is like the first piece of business for a new administration, whoever that may be. So thinking about how, what you ask for out of the next government, I think is really important, and you shouldn't take for granted. And then I think part of it is the political architecture is always more visible. It's easy to, I'm a political appointee, Sean Donovan, Valerie Jarrett, a lot of our city's folks are city mayors that make up our cabinet. But there are a large number of people who do the work over decades and trying to make the connection to the architecture, whether that's the departments you have at HUD and HHS for working with philanthropy. I think sustaining that kind of architecture inside the federal bureaucracy is really important. So making sure that whatever engagement you have goes one layer deep. I think if we had it to do again, we'd start that earlier than we've done. So I don't know if that gets you to joy, but those are a couple places. I do think the joint investment in our people, things that are happening that I heard yesterday in our breakout sessions, sound very similar to some of the work we're doing. I think you have a little more freedom for experimentation than exists within kind of the statutes of limitations of being an agency under scrutiny from Congress. But I think finding a way to share the best practices across a much less hierarchical network is really key. And I think I'm letting you know partly this inside architecture so you can find it for the next folks. But you have a huge voice in shaping the next piece.
Thanks.
With the federal government, it's like probably a very specific example, but like I know the city of Phoenix applied for various federal TOD dollars, and they're part of a 10-year build-out plan. They're in year 3, right? And something that was really helpful from philanthropy was actually, there was a moment, so it's year 3, and they had a convening that was driven by philanthropy, had the federal TOD department, had the city of Phoenix, and had Valley Metro, who was the private contractor handling light rail. And it was invite only, and community members were not invited, right? It was just philanthropy and a few like selected community folks that were like kind of the inside players. And one of the things that happened was, Vitalis was able to invite me to that space and be in a place that I otherwise wouldn't have been in, where the conversation was about equitable transit-oriented development, where I had learned that through a small grant from this office, the city of Phoenix and Valley Metro got money to produce an environmental impact assessment that I had talked about earlier. And this is through the frame of equitable transit-oriented development. And here's a moment where it seemed like, as what would be a grantee, right, to the city, what it seemed like was, let's help you better understand ETOD. And the entire conversation was centered around the need to connect with that local population, that local lived experience. And yet, like, here was a space that was driven by the ETOD department and about the money that the city of Phoenix and Valley Metro was trying to receive, right? And the way I look at it is that, city of Phoenix, call it ETOD, call it TOD, call it whatever you want. There's a pot of money that we want to get in South Phoenix, hits all the benchmarks for an equitable transit-oriented development dollars. And they're moving in that direction. And I found it very, very helpful for Philanthropy to be like, intentionally, we need to get community folks in this space. We need to figure out how to get more folks in this space. Post that meeting, right? What came out of that meeting was this conversation about why aren't we talking about a restorative justice lens around development, especially transit-oriented development? Because if we're going to talk about equity, we need to acknowledge what has happened. And it seems like right now, like the federal TOD folks were like, yes! And Philanthropy was like, yes! And then the City of Phoenix and Valley Metro were like, I don't know about that, right? Like very uncomfortable. But I do think in terms of role, post that, like, Vitalists and friends are still in conversations with Valley Metro and the City of Phoenix. So is LISC, right? So are a number of other like major players who got the invite, and they now have a special role to continue to push this idea of restorative justice, to continue to engage with the federal TOD department outside of the city, outside of Valley Metro, to hopefully wrap around and continue to push the conversation with the city and these players. So that I feel like as a community partner looking at Philanthropy as a real partner, I see that as like extremely helpful.
Great. Well, all right, final question, and then I want you guys to have final thoughts, brief final thoughts after this question. Thank you.
Hey, Joe, can you just follow up a little bit on, I've heard a lot about restorative justice in terms of criminal justice system, but this is, I think, the first time I've heard it in terms of transit-oriented development. And I'm guessing it means like historically there's been, freeways that plow through low-income communities and development that hasn't taken into, but how does that play out? How does a plan for having transit-oriented development through a restorative justice lens play out?
So we're still learning, one. And this is a new framework for myself as well, and I'm learning. Here's what I've gotten from it so far, right, is that, yes, it's in the criminal justice lens, and what I understand is that restorative justice was an early framework to handle crime in early societies, and they understood crime as an act against the community. Therefore, addressing crime is an opportunity to create a better community by fundamentally transforming the individual lives of those involved. Cool. Totally got that, right? So then I said, right, like that's very, very, very condensed version of a really, really extensive body of work that I'm barely learning. But through that basic understanding, and this all came from the community-based participatory research, right? Because we're like, what does this mean? We looked at that and we said, all right, so if that's the framework, then how do we understand land use decisions that create environmental injustice as an act against the community? And therefore, addressing environmental injustice is an opportunity to create a fundamentally greater community by transforming the lives involved. And so how can we utilize equitable transit-oriented development to transform space into means of restoring economic opportunity, physical health and well-being, environmental health and balance, and also restoring the history, culture, and legacy of the people who've been most directly impacted, because that's also part of the healing. And so that's our, right, like very nascent understanding of what it means to look at development through a restorative justice lens. Again, I am learning tons about this from people outside of Arizona. And I think that I'm looking to deepen that understanding, but that's our starting point.
Terrific. Final thoughts from each of you that you might want to just leave us with. It's not required, but I don't want you to miss the opportunity. Some of you had to justify federal budget travel regulations to be here. We got to get everything we can out of you. At our next convening in 2 weeks, by the way, every Fed is on as a speaker, so we figured out a way to cover. Anyway, go ahead. Final thoughts.
I feel like that was a tee up for me, Steve,
Yeah, you
so
don't
I'll take it.
have to. All right, you don't have to be the first.
First, I'll say the president, it's like, my great privilege to serve this president, and he has charged us very clearly. I think the day after, I'll never forget, the day after the 2012 crushing elections, the president came to the morning staff meeting, just like popped. There's a door that doesn't usually open. He just like popped in and said, I believe the federal government is the largest organization on earth with the power to do good, and we're going to use every single day to do as much good as we possibly can. So I will offer you this, that I have 121 days left, and if you think there is something that we are missing, I am not hard to find. That is one of our charges. I also wanted to say here that we're building mindfully something that's bigger than any individual person. That is part of our core too. And to that end, to take it from the very heady to the very practical, on November 29th, December 1st and 2nd, we're going to do our next gathering of federal leaders from around the country. It will be in Washington, D.C. If you have some idea about how we connect this work to your work, I'm all ears on that as well. And just thank you for having me here. This has been really, personally and just for the work, very useful. So.
Great. Javier or Joseph?
So my final thought is actually kind of an answer to the question of like, hey, reactions to folks on the panel, so that you heard my federal department reaction. But I will say with art, so I never considered myself an artist, and actually probably devalued it for a really long time. I was like, I'm too busy fighting, right? And I will say through the relationships that I've built over time with artists in particular, what stood out is the need for so much healing work. Because again, right, like these communities have been under pressure for a really long time. And like we have explored over the last few days, there's decks stacked against us, and more so depending on where you are. And I find that the work of art and culture creation is part of that healing process. And I've come to really embrace the fact that we need to not just continuously put people in the fight mode, right? And that's appropriate, and it needs to be. And we need to have those warriors on the ground, but they can't just be warriors. And I find that art exploration has really been the way to get people an opportunity to embrace that other parts of themselves. And they're fundamentally stronger for it, because the way they see the world after a moment to express something that may have been really deep inside just opens up a whole new world of then dreaming and reimagining, okay, then what could we do with this space? And more importantly, what could I do with this space? What could I bring to this? And I've not found anything more effective to help folks imagine and reimagine and re-envision than really investing in arts-based practices to help cultivate that. So I just wanted to say that because I feel like healing has been such a major thing around this conversation, and healing, especially utilizing, art's all about self-expression, and oftentimes these folks don't get a chance to express themselves. And so give them the space to like fly with it, and they'll blow your mind. So it's the one thing that I've been taking away over the last few days.
So Javier, I'm pretty sure Joseph just stole your closing comment, but anything you want to add? Final.
I think I wanted to start with thank you. It's been really great to be in this space with all of these really brilliant people doing work across so many sectors and so many places. It's been great to sort of hear the conversation from a different angle. And I think that the same way that I have been, I'm grateful for having been challenged by the way that you all see the work. I'll put a challenge back out to all of you to really, you all know that this work is complex. Housing isn't just housing, and transportation isn't just transportation, and these things are all interrelated. And to realize that they're often interrelated because of the cultural norms of a place, and to expand your minds as you think about the role that arts and culture can play, that it's not just about a statue or a sculpture or a song or a dance, but it's literally like what you chose to put on this morning, or how you choose to greet somebody when you meet them. It is everything how we choose to express ourselves and how we walk down the street. And to realize that leaving that out from the really important work that we're doing ends up placing us slightly back in a framework that's created all of the challenges that we're trying to solve. And so just want to encourage you, as you all thinking so creatively about how to address some of these systemic and structural issues, how could you or how might you layer in an understanding of the cultural fabric or the artistic practices or the cultural history of a place when you're thinking about doing your work?
Well, let me just also close by saying thank you. You know, you all traveled great distances, navigated all kinds of complexity to be here. You are flying home to New York through LAX. I think that's some form of artistic expression. I don't know. But you guys honor us with your time, with your wisdom. You really, I think, help stimulate a lot of great thought. And so we appreciate all three of you being with us and the great wisdom you shared. Thank you. Thanks. Let's thank them.